Welcome to the London Business School webinar series, Beyond the Crisis. I'm Julian Birkinshaw, I'm your host for this series. And if you are a regular attendee, you'll note that that's a new name we've given to this series. I'll say a little bit more about why we've done that at the end of today's session. Today's webinar is The Adaptable Animal, the Evolutionary Context and Practical Tactics for Building Your Resilience. And I'm going to be joined by two colleagues to discuss this fascinating issue. First of all, Emeritus Professor Nigel Nicholson, who's a real expert on the application of evolutionary thinking to the world of business. Welcome, Nigel.
Nice to be with you in this new virtual reality. Thank you.
Thanks. Also joining us is Adjunct Professor Richard Jolly, who is an expert on aspects of managing change and interpersonal dynamics and a number of other things as well. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Julian. Good to be here.
I believe you're joining us from Ohio in the US. Is that correct?
I am, absolutely. Columbus, Ohio.
So, without any more ado, let me hand over to Nigel. Nigel, would you like to share your screen and get us started?
Hello. Thank you very much, Julian. Well, our theme is the adaptable animal. And I don't know what your experience was of the initial announcement of the lockdown. But I thought, well, 3 weeks is going to be really tough. And here we are, 8 weeks, and it's amazing how quickly we prove ourselves to be adaptable to a new normal. I want to look beyond this and to consider what evolutionary theory tells us about what might be some of the outcomes of what's happening to us now. It's a very profound change. And I do want to preface this by saying, and I'm sure Richard would concur, that none of what I have to say mitigates in one iota all the suffering and difficulty that people on the front line and in their everyday lives have been experiencing. So here's a law I want to discuss, which is the greater the shock, the more radical the adaptive response. And I want to talk about this in three contexts, really. Number one, about how we came to exist, the evolution of species. Secondly, I want to talk about cultural evolution and how institutions and society change. And third, I want to talk about human lives. And I hope some of my biography students are tuned in, because this is obviously a major theme in our work in biography. And typically the sentiment might be calm seas do not make for good sailors. So adaptation is an everyday reality in people's lives. Here's a history of the planet, and let's start with the big picture. And you see there have been 5 great extinctions in the history of the planet. I've indicated 3 of them. The 6th one, which is upon us now, I'll just say a word about that. The third one there is the Permian extinction, which wiped out 70% of all life on Earth and 95% of marine life. And it created a huge gap, therefore, for the dinosaurs and fish to evolve and so on. Which was in turn wiped out by the extraterrestrial arrival of a meteorite in the Gulf of Mexico that removed all the dinosaurs and created the age of mammals. We humans have constructed the 6th extinction, which is happening right now. And I don't want to talk about that today. Let's keep it within our scope. Why does this happen, though? Well, the first thing that happens when there's a radical change of environment is extinction. It's the most likely outcome, that species lose their habitat, they lose their resources, they lose their defenses. Species also habitat track. They move, they migrate to find more hospitable contexts. And we're finding now flora and fauna arriving in Britain, which wouldn't have been here 30 years ago, like wine growing, for example. Niche construction. Now, this is a rather special one. Termites and beavers, and especially humans, we construct our own environments, and humans are past masters at this. This is what we do especially well. Now, the least likely outcome, and yet the most important, is evolution. That's the development of new qualities and capabilities. And may I say, the evolutionary process is very interesting because it goes extremely fast, and then it then finds a new equilibrium pretty quickly. So here we are, humans. We emerged, when there was a period of global cooling, then the savanna environments arrived. Apes came out of the trees and started walking on two legs, not literally, but that's how that's essentially the new model which we have inherited. Let's look at human history now. Let's move on to the institutional level. And I've illustrated here a whole bunch of things that happened in the last 1,000 years. It's a slightly UK-centric view. But let's just talk about some of the 2 or 3 that are most relevant. I guess one of the great is the great pandemic of the plague from 1340 and onwards, which produced a huge legacy, of it brought the legal system, secularization, the reduction of faith, new public entertainments, and all of this, of course, is a byproduct of the increased value of labor through the decimation. I mean, a third of the population of Europe disappeared. The last great pandemic was during the Spanish flu, which coincided with the Great War, and that also produced huge consequences: decolonization, new technology, human rights, women's rights especially, perhaps, and evolution changes in healthcare. Well, I'm not going to be a futurologist and try to predict what the consequences of the current pandemic will be, but let's just say what happens in this process is that history is speeded up. Here we have an accelerator. These great events in every case were an accelerator. And I haven't seen anything like this in my lifetime. So I'm expecting certain things to accelerate and change. And it's very hard to predict what they'll be. But I want to talk about the processes. So let's look at it through this lens. Let's go back to those 4 different responses to change and look at what happens to businesses in that context. Well, I'm afraid one of the most common things will be death. Businesses will go out of it, will sadly disappear. There'll be loss of markets, loss of resources. Others will habitat track. London Business School is doing that right now, I guess, moving online, finding new customer bases as well. Niche construction. This is, by the way, in business context, I wrote a paper from the Academy of Management Review a couple of years ago about this is a special role for leaders, is niche construction. And of course, people like Henry Ford and Steve Jobs could say they changed the markets they inhabited. And evolution, this also I think will be more common than it is in the animal world. In cultural terms, cultural evolution can happen very rapidly. New systems, new capabilities, new technologies, operating models, and a change to culture. I wrote this book a few years ago, The Eye of Leadership, which is essentially about adaptive leadership. And the center of the book is this model, seeing, being, doing, a model of human adaptation. And you can see how this mediates the nature of the changes that we're talking about. So here we have a shock that's happened to it. Its magnitude is it's not as great as some of the pandemics we've had, but it's certainly more universal than many. And it's pretty focused in who it's affecting. The adaptive response amongst all of us is a change to the way we see. It's also a change to the way we feel about things, and it's a change to the way we do things. And the outcomes of this, as well as some of the negative outcomes, are going to be fresh insights, changes to our sense of identity as individuals and as groups, and indeed for strategies for living. Just to expand that a little bit, let's just look at this a little bit more closely. One of the things that I think a lot of people may feel is that they have a quite different view about their own capacity for adapting, and certainly a quite different view about the nature of the environment in which they work and live. And that seeing difference could be quite profound. Being, well, we retain a lot of the essences of who we are, but you can see for a lot of people, they have a renewed sense of purpose. I certainly feel every telephone call I have with my children and my grandchildren has a renewed significance. It was particularly notable when the Secretary of Health asked for 250,000 volunteers. He got 700,000 within days. So clearly people are really finding things that are really important and different for them to do. And of course, innovations in working, relating, and recreating. And again, talking to members of my family, my daughters, both of them say things will never be the same again in their working environments. They're working from home, but they found new efficient solutions to familiar problems. So the impacts, and I think Richard is going to say more about some of these, the impacts that people are suffering are the following. I mean, there's, huge loss for many people, and certainly disappointed or thwarted expectations and futures that people feel may be blighted. People are suffering deprivation. They're having to make do on less. Uncertainty and threat is a burden on a lot of people. And of course, huge increases in workload for those people, again, like my kids who were trying to educate their children at the same time as do their jobs. And of course, for all of us, restricted scope and restriction in what we can do. Let's look at some of the consequences of this and what happens. So it's multiplied by individual differences. That's the first thing I just should mention this, because at the end of this, you know, there are going to be some people who say, looking back, maybe 10 years hence, this was one of the best times of their lives. And there are other people who say quite the opposite. So everything has to pass through the filter of individuality. But the positive outcomes of these is, if you have a negative stimulus, you try to remove it. And loss and disappointment, after perhaps a period of grieving, you reinvest that energy. Deprivation and poverty, well, you find new opportunities, you strive, you look for new things. Uncertainty and threat, you want to resolve it. So what do? You explore, and you talk more. You find other people to connect with. Workload and burden, you simplify and reorder. I remember I was doing, I went to give a seminar in Nigeria about leadership, but it was during a recession. All they wanted to talk about was what's good about a recession. So I said, okay, on one side of one column, make a list of all the things that are bad about a recession. On the other, all the things that are good. And although the things on the bad side are pretty bad, the list on the other side was longer. It's a cliche to say never waste a good crisis, but this is a time when people will have the opportunity to reorient their priorities in some quite radical ways. And of course, restriction. Well, that's something that we've all suffered, and we've found new ways of playing, new ways of creating, and some of those are going to stick for us. Some of those visible adaptations that we can see now are the following. Infection awareness is greater. We're having virtual meetings. Fitness regimes, people, you know, I can see people in my own family doing lots of different things. Use of time is, of course, radically changed. Flexible working is become imperative. Changed consumption of media. Certainly different change awareness of community. Certainly my people in my street all talk to each other in a way that we haven't talked since I've lived here. And of course, spending patterns are going to alter. That's of interest to economists, and some of those are going to stick. So let's just, I'm just going to bring this to a close now. So from this microcosm of individual reactions, we get a changed orientation, and these will have to be accommodated by institutional life. So you can say smart, savvy organizations will revise their structures. They will change their institutional rules to make new things possible. New cultural norms are going to affect all of us, the way we behave in public, the way old ways will return, but some things will also stay from this. Ways of interacting, making decisions, and of course, lots of creative enterprises and new artifacts are going to emerge from this. And this is going to affect every area of public life. I've given a list, it's a pretty exhaustive list actually. I mean, the leisure we can see, and travel, healthcare, technology, and certainly education, as we're experiencing with our colleagues, trade and politics. So just a closing slide. There's no social distancing with some groups. Here, me with some of my friends some years ago. I just want to thank you for being with me here today. It's a privilege. I hope my remarks have stimulated some fresh thoughts for you all and some comfort perhaps in the gloom. But we have a couple of poll questions, and I think we could probably proceed to those now, Julian.
Yep,
Are we on time?
agreed. So let's pull up the first poll, in some ways a kind of a summary or kind of a refresher on what we talked about. The question is, what has surprised you about your experiences of the lockdown? I think the idea is we tick as many of these as we would like to.
Yes, it's a multiple option. You may have experienced all of them, because the last one is negates all the ones above. If you think nothing has really surprised you and life has carried on as normal, then please do indicate that. So your capacity to put up with restriction, have you coped much better than you thought you would? Are you finding new ways of working and interacting with people? You're discovering new sources of media, entertainment, new interests, hobbies or activities? You finding a new sense of cooperation and community around you? You may be finding the opposite, but I want to just see how many of you are experiencing any of those. Okay. Well, that's interesting. I think it speaks for itself. I think everybody is experiencing, both the one that catches my eyes, the new interests and hobbies and activities, so people are perhaps finding more time for a lot of the things that are familiar, and also with the media. But new ways of working seems to be at a premium there. Very interesting, and very few people say nothing much has changed. Okay, let's go on a bit further. Let's look at the lasting consequences of the pandemic for you. It's hard to anticipate what these will be, but what do you think, might stick from this list? Do you think you're going to have a different lifestyle and routines? Do you think things are going to change in your personal lifestyle? Do you think you find new ways of working? Do you think it'll improve the qualities of some of your relationships? Will you be hooking up with old friends and family more in different ways? Your attitudes to public life and politics, maybe that will change. Or maybe you might find really things are going to go back to normal. Well, less than 1 in 10 think things are going to be the same. And the new ways of working is topping that list, as well as lifestyle and routines. That's so interesting, isn't it? And improved relationships, well, the way that's comforting that your relationships are already good enough and they don't need to improve so much. But these are the seeds, of course, that are going to help populate the new forests that this forest fire has swept through.
Perfect.
So
Thank you very much, Nigel. That was terrific. And so let's, if you can stop sharing the screen. And Richard, I'm going to give the floor to you. Lots of questions already coming in to Nigel. I'm going to hold those questions until Richard has spoken. So if we can bring you in.
So I just want to build on Nigel's, magisterial sweep across millennia and talk about very much about today. And for about the last 10, 12 years, I've been talking about somebody who teaches organizational change. I've been talking about VUCA, living in VUCA times. And I think now more than ever, we live in this sort of what von Clausewitz called this sort of fog of war. So VUCA, if you're not familiar with it, is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous situations. And there's a very important point here for me, which is that there was always been a career path here, which is as we got more senior, increasingly, things became clearer. So when you started off at the bottom of the organization, it was like being at the bottom of a mountain, and you slowly worked your way up to the top. And when you were at the top of the mountain, you could see clearly and set strategy and cascade information down the mountainside. And so this was the sort of fantasy there of emerging into this clarity. The problem right now for all of us is I think we're all lost in the fog. And the uncertainty is clearly something that Nigel said it was 8 weeks we've been in lockdown here, and exactly when we're going to be able to get back to normal is something we really don't know in so many different ways. There was a poll published today which showed that in terms of different professions and how optimistic they are about the future, the bottom of the list was education. And as Julian smiles, as I think all of us in the business school world are very much part of that uncertainty of when are we going to be able to get back to normal. And there's an important point here psychologically, is that, from a cognitive point of view, our brains don't cope well with uncertainty. It's something that we just don't do very well. In fact, there's a phenomenon two researchers at University of Michigan came up with called the backfire effect, which shows that if someone presents you data that doesn't fit with your view of the world, it just backfires, and we actually retrench even more deeply into our previous views. In this time of uncertainty, I want to do a quick poll here just to really talk about what are some of the key stresses for me right now. So I'm genuinely curious in the spirit of research to understand of these issues here, which of these, and again, multiple choice, so you can pick all of them if you want. So personal financial situation, worries about money, career uncertainty for you, your organization. Some people have got an excessive short-term workload, loss of structure and boundaries between work and home. The opposite of excessive workload, some of us are struggling with motivation and productivity, medical concerns, either real or potential for those, and obviously yourself and those around you. Self-control and discipline. Not everyone has found it possible to be completely self-controlled in the last 8 weeks. And for those of you, particularly with children at home, childcare and homeschooling, but for all of us, personal relationships can be a stressor. So I'm curious to hear which of these come out for each of you. Okay, so career uncertainty is the top here, and it's a pretty well-balanced one. I don't know whether the childcare, homeschooling, and personal relationships, maybe that was too broad a category there, but I'm delighted to hear that that is one of the lowest. Although clearly none of you are working too hard right now, given that the excessive short-term workload is the lowest for each of you. So that fits very neatly with where I want to go with this, because what we really find is these are what we call the stressors, the thing that cause stress for us, and all of us will inevitably have a stress response. And so how does a stress response really work? Well, the point is that short-term stress, this creates a hormonal response in us. We produce a bunch of hormones like adrenaline, keep us that fight or flight sharpness, cortisol to give us energy to cope. But the problem with cortisol is prolonged high levels of cortisol become toxic. It affects our overall sense of wellness or illness. Our mental sharpness versus mental dullness. And so there's a really important point here for me. There's two elements here that I think are inevitable for most of us in this sort of short-term lockdown situation. And the first of them is what we call brain fog, and finding it hard to really sort of concentrate and really feel on top of it for prolonged periods. And the second one is fatigue. So many of us are finding ourselves, even though maybe we're not doing as much as we used to do, people like myself who were on a plane pretty much every week of my life, we haven't got all the jet lag and the time zone differences, although I'm having to lecture at 4 a.m. Sometimes, which is a challenge. But this whole fatigue is a very important issue. Sleep, even though many of us may not be having excessive workload, we may not be sleeping as well as we otherwise would because of the anxiety and because of the stress. Behavioral stability versus lapses, those sort of irritability, mood swings. And the final one is our immune system. And if I've taught you on some of my course at LBS, I've got a long list of all the symptoms of an impaired immune system. We won't go into those right now, it's a bit too stressful. But I want to do focus on one of the key ones here, which is sleep. Because people who are sleep deprived, people who are not getting high quality sleep, perform as well as people who are intoxicated. And so sleep deprivation, alcohol impairment, some of you may be experiencing both of these. In fact, the sort of triumvirate here of not getting enough sleep, drinking too much alcohol, and maybe even too much snacking may be something that affects all of us. And I was actually watching a YouTube video a couple of days ago about how to clean your pool, and there was a lovely comment here from Jay at the bottom of this slide. The JN says, "I need sleep. I don't even have a pool. What the hell am I doing here?" Again, the ability to waste time on all sorts of social media platforms, all sorts of internet activities is a very common issue. But I want to stand back from all of these short-term stresses to really think about, for me, the important question here. And it's a question I've asked thousands of executives and students over the last 10 years, which is, when we look back over our lives, what will be the things that really mattered the most to us, the things that we really value? When you do this, when you ask this question, it is so consistent. Wherever people are in the world, whatever kind of age or profession, the things that will really matter to us the most are relationships. And it's typically core relationships, people that we're close to. It is also experiences and activities and time for ourselves, looking at making sure health and wellness, these sorts of issues. The problem is, if we look at our short-term situation right now, and clearly, this is what Nigel called the new normal, this is a temporary new normal, though, and exactly what's going to emerge out of this is clearly something that is extremely uncertain. But right now, the question it leads to for me is, to what degree are we focusing our time and energy right now on the things that really matter to us? And for me, that is the huge opportunity. And Nigel touched on this as well, which is that sometimes it'll be, many people say this was the best time of their lives, and other people will say this was a terrible time. And one of the sad realities of any crisis is that it exacerbates inequality. The people who are affluent and doing well tend to do relatively well. The people who are really struggling beforehand and people who are thrown into challenges during the crisis will do particularly badly. So there is a polarization here. But for me, the fundamental underlying point here is around attitude. And what really is the attitude that we bring to the things in our lives. And there's a quotation that I read many years ago now from Ben Franklin, who said, some people die at 25 and aren't buried until 75. And my hope is that one of the benefits, one of the positives to come out of this lockdown situation is people really being able to have time to reflect on what matters to them, to make sure that you're not one of these people that Ben Franklin is talking about, that all of us here are able to focus on the things that when we look back over our lives, hopefully in many, many years' time, will we have spent our time and energy on the things that really matter to us. This is a quotation that I've used with many students and executives over the years. For me, it captures this point about what it means to really live a life without regrets. And it's from the great Mark Twain, who said, 20 years from now, you'll be more disappointed by the things that you didn't do than by the ones you did do. So throw off the bowlines, the ropes, sail away from the safe harbor. And that really leads us into the second half of what I want to talk about in this session here. This brings us on to our second poll. And this is a much shorter poll. It is not a multiple choice. What I want to do is get a sense from you of to what degree do you see yourself mainly, most of the time, as an optimist, or on the other side as a pessimist. And pessimists sometimes call themselves realists. And so you may sort of call yourself a pessimist, a realist rather than a pessimist, which is fine. So these are the two categories, and it's one or the other. So I'm curious to see how you guys divide yourself up between these two. Okay, so 2/3 optimists, 1/3 pessimists and realists. This is really an important point for me, because in the research around stress, one of the questions that we ask is, do you believe that stress is harmful to your health? Now, again, I'm not going to do a poll on this because then I have to kind of humiliate you if you get the answer wrong, because the point about this question is, however you answer it, you'll be right. If you believe that stress is harmful to your health, then you are much more likely to get ill. If, however, you believe that stress is a positive and you can reframe it in that way, then stress can actually be something that leads us to get healthier and stronger in many, many ways. And this is what we call the stress paradox. So changing your mind about stress changes how your body responds to stress. It's not just a mental thing, it fundamentally changes your body. So you can actually, through having stressful experiences, what we call good pain, it can actually help us improve our physical recovery, improve our immunity, and leave us stronger and healthier. And this concept of good pain is something that I think is very profound. There's clearly bad pain. But good pain is experiences that are difficult, that are hard, that are uncomfortable. But if we consistently stay with them and live these patterns of behavior that are challenging, we actually get stronger. And so some of the key researchers here said the experience of stress can enhance the development of mental toughness, heightened awareness, new perspectives, a sense of mastery, strengthened priorities, deeper relationships, a greater appreciation for life, and an increased sense of meaningfulness. And so what we're going through right now is a time that for all of us will look back on. As a time where we remember where we were, and hopefully it's a unique time in all of our lives. It's what's sometimes called a crucible experience. And crucible experiences, experiences that are difficult and painful. But like metal being forged on an anvil, it's an experience that can make us stronger. And clearly, bad things are happening. And for many people, particularly people, financial and medical issues, this is an absolutely brutal time, as I was saying earlier. And so, like Nigel, I don't want to underestimate in any way the fact that, bad things are happening to many people right now. But there's an important thing here that for me is very profound, which is, whilst there are many things in our life we can't control, there are some things we can control. And one of these, in fact, the most profound of them, is our attitude, our response. We can always control how we respond to the events that happen to us, good or bad. And so the best way of summarizing this is through the famous Serenity Prayer by Reinhold Niebuhr, who said, "God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." And I think this is just genius, because having that ability to just accept the things we cannot change. And clearly right now, with the amount of uncertainty, for many of us, like myself, our lifestyles have completely changed. My income has come down dramatically, and the uncertainty in the educational world is certainly very, very strong. But whilst these are beyond our control, the challenge here is to focus on the things that we can influence, the courage to change the things we can. And I think that's the opportunity that we have right now. Because when you look at any system, it can be a fragile system like a glass. If you drop a glass, it is likely to get weaker. There are some systems that are resilient systems that are able to cope with stuff. But Nicholas Taleb wrote a wonderful book about exactly this issue. And he said, look, there's not even a word for it in this English language, but there are some systems that actually, when they go through pressure and have this stress, they actually get stronger. And the word he came up with was an anti-fragile system, which is a clumsy word, but it's trying to get at something very profound for me here, which is whenever we have a change experience, be it something positive or something negative, do we frame it optimistically as an opportunity, or do we frame it pessimistically as a threat? And this is something that we absolutely can control. And those of you who are realists / pessimists, you may say, well, bad things happen. But the problem with being a pessimist is that it's an attitude. And there's a whole bunch of research on this. The Mayo Clinic in particular has done research that shows that people who are pessimistic have a much higher risk of mortality, premature death than people who are optimistic. And so the real challenge here is how we frame things in our mind. And so Nietzsche's famous quotation here, that what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, is something that as we look coming out of this pandemic lockdown, what's going to happen here is that the people who, as Nigel said, had the best time of their lives aren't simply the people who were financially comfortable and medically well, and the people around them were healthy. It's the people who are able to really focus their time and energy on the things that really matter. Because right now, the lack of boundaries we have in our lives right now is very, very profound. And Sigmund Freud talked about this thing, that the people we're closest to, it's a bit like porcupines. We can sort of spike each other very easily. And so the lack of boundaries we've got in our lives right now means that it's very easy to have the sort of personal, professional lives really sort of becoming very complicated. But if we come back and focus on what really matters to us, spending time in lockdown, really focusing on the things that in the longer run will make us sort of happy and make us profound, really focusing on the relationships, the things, the hobbies and interests that really we are able to really spend some time on now that we weren't when we were leading our much busier and more stressful lives. The hope is here that many of us can take more control and come out of this stronger than we were before. And it's not simply about the reality around us. It's fundamentally about our attitude. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So if you can just stop sharing your slides and we'll get the three of us up on the screen here. So lots of questions as always. And obviously I'm not going to get to all of them, but I'm going to get to a chunk of them. And if anyone's interested, there's about 1,000 people answered those polls. So lots of the questions are in the same category around this notion that the world is going to change sort of forever. We're not going back to normal. I want to go to Nigel first on this, because obviously you are kind of an evolutionary psychologist, I guess an academic might say. In other words, you look at these big changes over tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years in human behavior, but also you're talking about much more rapid adjustments within our own lifetimes. How do you help us get our heads around these two very different things that are going on at the same time? In other words, well, I'll let you answer the question.
Okay, thanks.
Exactly where I'm going with this.
I didn't put up my slide of the 10 human instincts, and of course there are instinctive things that we react to. So, for example, we focus much more on loss than we do on gain. That's a sort of self-protective measure. We have strong needs for belonging and for contact. So I think, for example, the deprivation of intimacy that's been thrust upon us, that's going to recover. We will have intimacy again, and when vaccines comes on, those things. But we have discovered that we will discover a lot of interactions that aren't that critical. We don't need that level of intimacy. So I think the framework of social life will change to quite a large degree. I think the point about the widening deprivation gap is very interesting. I think actually we might actually find a bit of a reversal of that when we realize a lot of the people who seem to be most essential to society's functioning are undervalued. And we could see, I think, quite a change in attitudes towards that element of the economy. I mean, I don't want to be a kind of Nostradamus here and try to make a lot of predictions, but I think we underestimate the degree to which, I mean, I think you said, Julian, when we were talking privately, oh, you think, things, we will reestablish quite a lot of equilibrium. Well, we will in lots of respects, but I think many aspects of institutional life will look different, feel different, and our attitudes will be changed. We won't forget this, as Richard said. This is a profound event for us, and it's something I've not seen in my very long lifetime.
So, Richard, I'm going to bring you in a second, but I want to just push on one additional question to Nigel, because Nigel, you've written before about the fact that we human beings are forced to work in large organizations, often in large buildings, yes. And this doesn't come naturally to us. A lot of us, are still kind of hankering for the good old days when we could operate in much smaller social circles. So, so pushing on that logic, I mean, is this lockdown actually going to accelerate the move towards working in slightly different sort of social groupings?
If it presages increased flexibility, then it will indeed. I mean, there's an organization, the Flight Center, I guess they must be having some difficulties at the moment, but they model their organization after something I wrote in the Harvard Business Review around families, villages, and tribes, making sure that they had clusters, shops, and so on that don't exceed 150, which is the kind of the magic evolutionary number for the size of a human community. So that feeling of, I think the savvy organizations will realize that you can build a culture that doesn't have to be over-regulated if it is of a human, if it's on human dimensions. This is a tremendous opportunity for that. Whether companies take it or not, the smart ones will. And I guess the smart ones already have. I mean, I've looked at the Cambridge hub, for example, and firms there, and people are kind of doing that instinctively. The most powerhouse companies don't go corporate. It's not a good solution. It's only good for efficiency and production.
Got it. Richard, your thoughts on this important issue?
Well, I've just been looking through a lot of the questions here, and a lot of what people are talking about here it does seem to be focusing on this issue of optimism versus pessimism. So that's the thing that's particularly on my mind here. I think clearly, what's going to happen in terms of the new, what emerges out of this, there's going to be fundamental shifts for me. I think that is inevitable. But it's very hard to really know. I think one of the things that is definitely going to change is attitudes to business travel versus virtual meetings. And for me, as somebody who lectures at London Business School and lives in the US, I'm delighted that I think virtual is going to be more acceptable here. So hopefully I'll spend a little bit less time on planes than I did before. But I did really want to pick up on this issue of optimism versus pessimism, because there's a whole bunch of questions about this here. And particularly the issue of, is this something that's ingrained, or is this something that actually is something that we can change? Are you born a pessimist or an optimist? And as Nigel knows, clearly a lot of our personality, I think about half of it is genetically encoded, but a lot of it is based on our experiences. And part of my background was working as a psychotherapist. And this has been a fundamental shift in the therapy world, which is an understanding that actually we can really choose our response to situations. And so there's a thing called cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very powerful and very effective. And all it is doing is teaching people simple techniques about how to reframe things. And Dan Cable, in his recent webinar, as part of the same series, was talking about all of this. There's a wonderful body of research around gratitude. And this point about gratitude is, if you can actually express thanks to other people, then that has a huge impact on your well-being and on your attitude. And so learning some techniques of how to frame things, telling people things that you're grateful for from yourself, journaling, what are the 3 best things I did today, even if you've spent a bit too much time watching the Michael Jordan documentary and not enough time doing your long-term strategic planning, then actually there are things that you've achieved today, and just learning to be slightly gentler on ourselves at this time, for me, is an important part of that.
Good. I'm going to go back to one of the earlier questions from while Nigel was talking. Nigel, how do you respond to the assertion that people hate change? Gosh, discuss. Do people hate change? I mean, I can imagine you could spin this any number of ways.
Yes, the only person who likes change is a wet baby. And no, I don't subscribe to this view at all. I think we embrace change because change is part of life. It's part of growth. But we embrace it. But when we embrace it, like I said, some people don't call it change. And what people really mean is they don't really embrace change where they have no control. I think this is the problem. And of course, this is the element in stress that Richard was talking about. The key element in stress research, of course, is it's not just pressure and load, it's whether you have any control to cope with the flow of that pressure and control. So, good stress is often where people have the capacity to do something about it. If people are in victim situations, of course, and people are negative about change because it's usually imposed by someone else or someone outside, somebody who has some controlling power, and the person feels powerlessness. So I think this, to some extent, this is a question about power. Because change is positive if you can see that you have some control and you can manage the good outcomes. Of course, companies are very bad at this. They don't empower people nearly enough in order to cope with change. So people resist change in organizations because they know what's going to happen. They know it's going to be done by bureaucratic edict down the hierarchy of management.
Got it. Richard, do you want to just give us a couple of extra tips in addition to what Nigel said for how do we as leaders get that process right in the current context, I mean?
Yeah, well, I wrote a piece about this recently, which for me, I think the instinct that many of us have during any kind of difficult situation is to sort of disappear, go into our cave, as it's sometimes described. But I think one of the key things in any time of change that is so fundamental for any leader is to make sure that you're communicating effectively. Right now, I see some organizations, some leaders who are really just not doing enough communication across a range of platforms, and others are doing a very good job. And I think Francois here at LBS is doing a really very good job and the rest of the management team of communicating, continually. This is what's going on, because there's so much anxiety and uncertainty around. So I think the communication issue for me is absolutely fundamental, and often it's against our instincts because we only want to communicate if we think we've got good news. But the thing is, it's good pain, and being told what is going on, having a genuine, sort of authentic, realistic view of what's happening is much better than sort of pretending everything's going to be good. So optimism isn't some sort of fantastical state of denial, but it is talking about reality as it is.
Got it. Small question for you, Richard. You said prolonged stress is harmful. Someone wants to know what prolonged means.
Yeah. Yeah,
Can you give us a number here, or?
Yeah, well, Nigel is the evolution expert, can also chip in on this. But it used to be the case that you go out hunting from your, village, and you'd be hunting for a few hours, maybe a day or two, and then you'd be going back. So this is when you have prolonged sort of periods of stress over weeks and months. And this is, constantly, feeling you're working too much, not feeling in control, not sleeping well. And again, this chronic sleep deprivation point is particularly important. So prolonged stress is going into weeks or months, and certainly 8 weeks of a lockdown is enough time for prolonged stress.
Indeed, and it's the uncertainty about when it's over that makes us perhaps even more. Nigel, any thoughts on the timing here, on the number of weeks or months?
Well, I certainly don't think hunter-gatherers were suffering from stress, because they had a lot of self-control. They certainly had a lot of difficulties and challenges, but I think it's the measured life. And I think to some extent the lockdown has liberated lots of people. The people who are probably suffering from prolonged stress are those people who are trying to cope with the multiple burdens of fulfilling a job, looking after their kids and so on. It's just the load, and they still have more control often than they might have done in the old world. So prolonged, really, biochemically, I think these things build up in the bloodstream. And again, some people are more resilient than others, as Richard implied earlier, that certainly it is true. There are wide individual differences in people's capacity to deal with these kinds of inputs. So it's like, having a single R number doesn't make any sense in what's going on at the moment. I mean, there are multiple R numbers, there are multiple resilience measures, and it really is hugely subject to individual differences. And by the way, it's not, nature versus nurture. It's not either, your genes or your experience. Whatever you are has to go through the filter of experience before your resilience can emerge and be tested. And I think, as Richard said, that kind of annealing process of experience really matters.
Just to build on Nigel's point there, there's a wonderful concept, Dunbar's number, which he did an analysis called neocortex ratio that showed that human beings, the number of active social relationships we can maintain is 148, and this is very much how we've lived in communities of around 150 people, as Nigel's written about extensively over many years. And I think that's one of the things right now, is to really to feel as much as we can as part of a community, and how we do that in a socially distant way is a challenge. So, living here in Ohio, what we've been doing is we do have a garden, or a yard as they call it over here, and I bought an inflatable screen, and so we've been doing drive-in movies for friends, and projecting screens, and we're all socially distant in our cars with families. People come, watch the movie, and then go home, and it's just been a lovely way of really feeling more part of a community. And I know clearly you can't do that if you live in New York City or London, but finding ways.
Burgers as well, Richard.
Not socially distant, so no. But it's just finding ways, whatever we can, and obviously, some of the singing in some European cities, the clapping, just finding ways to feel connected is, for me, a very important way of how we can manage our stress levels and get that cortisol down, because we need cortisol. It's a healthy hormone, but the prolonged stress is when it just builds up and becomes toxic.
We've got time for two more questions. The first one is interesting. Faith. Do religious persuasions influence one's positioning in respect to the stress paradox? To what extent is faith, shall we say, helping us, or should we be, listening to the science, the hard science? I don't know whether either of you has a strong view on that.
Well, I'll just chip in on that. Nigel will probably have a more profound point of view, but for me, I mean, look at people who have high levels of what we call mean life satisfaction. People who have faith are, it is one of the things that people who have faith on average are happier than people without. So it's quite hard to sort of get faith just as a practical technique. It's more complicated than that. But so religion, because it does clearly give us some certainty that is there. The other things, by the way, in terms of the things that you can do that will actually increase your mean life satisfaction more than anything else. And number one is working in your own garden. And again, being a keen gardener myself, that's something that I fully understand. And the other one is having a pet. And it has to be a pet you can stroke. So goldfish don't work, but cats and dogs and things like that. People with so God and a dog is the way I've sometimes put it, and you'll do pretty well.
Nigel, your thoughts on faith?
Yes, it must be yarding, not gardening. Anyway, so my thoughts on faith, yes, I think there's lots of evidence that religion is good for you. And it's good for you both at the level it supplies existential comfort, it supplies community, it supplies structure and meaning and so on, all of those things. But let's just say it's not just religion that supplies those things. You can get those things from all sorts of other belief systems and ways of living. What's important is that you have meaning in your life, and that meaning has a structure that relates to the way you live. If it's a meaning that's just stuck in your head, well, it might provide you with some comfort, but it's meaning that translates into the fabric of lives and relationships that matters.
Good. So this is the last question. It's a meaty question. I want you've both written and researched and consulted on leadership styles. So a couple of people are asking about, we think leadership's going to have to adapt to face these new challenges. And I guess one particular way into it is, in a crisis, we kind of expect our leaders to be more forthright. We perhaps expect them to be a little bit more authoritative. Perhaps it's a more macho style of leadership, but I'm not completely convinced that is actually right. What are your thoughts on what styles of leadership work and whether we should be adapting even more?
Okay, well, I wrote a book about this. My book, The Eye of Leadership, is about adaptive leadership, and I'm very much a situational leadership thinker on this subject. And I also wrote an article which you could probably share with people if you want, Julian, for our London Business School review about managing in tough times. I think in times like this, you need to be up close and personal. I mean, with social distancing, that becomes a little hard. But what I mean is that leaders really need to understand the individual differences in response of the people they're managing, the people they're leading. They really do need to feel the fabric of and the leaders who are, who lead very much from the front without looking much behind are going to need, if they can't alter that style, which of course many of them would struggle with, they're going to need a cohort of people who really are able to help make them act intelligently in a changed landscape. So there will be a natural selection of leadership that makes some leadership styles that people have now as being not just redundant but repugnant.
Indeed, Richard.
Yeah, just to build on Nigel's point. For me, there's a distinction I draw between charismatic and inspirational leadership. And what you find is charismatic leaders tend to emerge during a crisis. And charismatic leaders, it's all about, I am a divinely inspired gift. Do what I tell you to do and you will be saved. And don't have to think about anything. Here is my dogma, here are the rules. Do this and you'll be fine. And when life is so uncertain, we get very much drawn into, many people get very drawn into looking for these charismatic figures who make the world very simple. They have absolutely no self-doubt. And that can be very powerful in the short term. The problem is, both if you are one of these people and also for the people around them, is that when the crisis is over, they tend to get killed. And it's not a very enduring one. But I would argue that more profoundly, what I see happening in many situations right now is not getting sucked into that dependency on some charismatic figure, because what I would call inspirational leaders, it's about creating much more profound relationships. Where we listen to each other, we actually work much more effectively, it's sort of moving with rather than, power over. And I think for me, that's what I really hope the technology is going to enable, is more meaningful interactions, much more listening, and much more sort of interdependence than dependence. And I think that for me is the power of what I have seen emerging before the pandemic, and my hope is that that'll become even more profound after this.
Perfect. So I think we are going to close now. Could we get that final slide up, please, Sarah? And I just want to make two observations before we finish. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge that we've changed the name of this series. It used to be called Leading Through a Pandemic. It's now called Out of the Crisis. And obviously, we are still in the pandemic. We're still in the lockdown, but it feels like there were some chinks of light at the end of that tunnel. And so we are definitely trying to move with the times and trying to be optimistic and what is kind of coming down that track. So that's why we've just changed the name to reflect the new zeitgeist, if you like. So what you see on the screen there is the next in our series, which is two colleagues, Louisa Alamani and Rupert Merson, both colleagues of mine in the Strategy and Entrepreneurship Group. We are looking particularly at startups. We're looking at how not to waste an opportunity in a crisis, sources of entrepreneurial opportunity, and startup financing. If you'd like to attend that webinar, please, you can absolutely register at the URL you see down there, london.edu/pandemic webinars. We will shortly be announcing the next set of webinars as well. We're going to be carrying on with this series all the way through, probably until mid-June, when I hope that all of us will be allowed out again. So without any further ado, I'm going to finish this session. Thank you once again to Nigel. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Julian.
Thank you all
Pleasure.
for listening and enjoying
well.
this. And we will see you again on Thursday. Thanks very much. Goodbye.